I died alone on an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a prisoner of the most powerful empire in the world. The man who had once controlled the destiny of 100 million people, reduced to asking permission to go for a walk. That is how the greatest rise in the history of modern Europe ended. And before you decide you know how it happened, let me tell you the story from the beginning. Because almost nothing about my life was what people think it was. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, Mediator of the Swiss Confederation, and the man whose legal reforms still govern the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people across 5 continents today. I was born on the 15th of August in the year 1769 in Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica, which had been transferred from the Republic of Genoa to France just 1 year before my birth. That timing made me technically French by the accident of a treaty signed 12 months before I entered the world. It was the first of many accidents that shaped everything that followed, and I learned early that the difference between accident and destiny is entirely a matter of what you decide to do with the material you are given. Corsica was not France. It was a Mediterranean island, with its own culture, its own language, its own fierce sense of identity, and a deep and recent resentment of French rule. My family, the Buonapartes, were minor Corsican nobility of Italian origin, educated and respectable, but nowhere near wealthy. My father Carlo was a lawyer who managed to obtain recognition of our noble status from the French authorities, which was essential because it was the only path to a free education at the French military academies that was available to a family of our means. When I was 9 years old, I was sent to the military school at Brienne in northern France, and the world I arrived in was one for which nothing in my Corsican childhood had prepared me. I was different from the other boys in every way that boys use to establish dominance over each other. I was small. I was poor. My French was heavily accented with Corsican and Italian inflections that my classmates found hilarious. My name, Napoleon Bonaparte, was so obviously un-French that the other students mocked it without mercy. I had no money for the small luxuries that made boarding school life bearable. I was proud in a way that poverty makes worse rather than better, because pride is sometimes the only currency a poor boy has. I responded to the mockery the way I would respond to every obstacle for the rest of my life. I found the one thing I was better at than everyone else, and I made it count for everything. In my case, that thing was mathematics and military strategy, and the absolute refusal to accept that the circumstances I had been born into were the circumstances I was obligated to die in. I graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1785, at 16 years old, in a single year instead of the usual 2, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery. My father had died of stomach cancer that same year, leaving me at 16 as the effective head of a large family with very little income and an enormous weight of responsibility. I was an artillery officer in the French army, a junior one, with no connections, no money, no influential family name, and no obvious path to advancement in a military system where promotion above a certain level was essentially reserved for the nobility. And then the world changed in a way that nobody had predicted and that opened doors that had never existed before. The French Revolution began in 1789 and tore apart the entire social structure of the country in which I was trying to build a career. The nobility that had blocked promotion for men like me was destroyed, exiled, or executed. The old army officer class evaporated almost overnight. Suddenly, a young artillery officer of modest origin with an exceptional mathematical mind, extraordinary strategic instincts, and an absolute willingness to work harder and think faster than anyone around him, found himself in a world where merit, or at least the appearance of it backed by audacity, could actually determine how far a man rose. I had been born at exactly the right moment for exactly the kind of person I was. I have never believed that was entirely an accident. My first major opportunity came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon, a port city that had risen against the revolutionary government and was being held with British naval support. The artillery commander was wounded, and I was given his position almost by default. I identified the key tactical position that everyone else had missed, placed my guns there against significant resistance from senior officers who outranked me and disagreed with my analysis, and forced the British fleet to withdraw, ending the siege and retaking the city. I was 24 years old. I was promoted to Brigadier General on the spot. The Corsican boy who had been mocked for his accent had just changed the course of a siege that the French Republic had been failing to resolve for months. I filed that lesson carefully. The system rewards results, and results are the only argument that cannot be dismissed. There is something I must tell you about before the campaigns, because it runs through everything I did and everything I became in ways that no military victory or political achievement can fully explain. Her name was Josephine. Rose de Beauharnais, a Creole widow from Martinique, 6 years older than me. Elegant and charming and socially connected in the complex and dangerous world of post-revolutionary Paris, in ways that I, still rough-edged and provincial, was not. I fell in love with her with an intensity that embarrassed me then, and that I have never fully been able to explain in terms that sound rational. I wrote her letters that historians have studied for 2 centuries, as documents of almost painful emotional exposure. I addressed her as my life, my soul, the only thought in my head. She found my devotion amusing and somewhat excessive. She was not faithful to me. I knew it and loved her anyway, which tells you something about the limits of intelligence as a protection against the heart. We married in 1796, and 2 days later, I left for Italy to take command of the Army of Italy, a force that was underfed, undersupplied, demoralized, and positioned against Austrian and Piedmontese forces that outnumbered and out-equipped them significantly. What followed over the next year was the campaign that made my reputation permanent and introduced Europe to a new way of fighting war. I moved faster than anyone thought possible, dividing my forces to strike multiple points simultaneously, keeping my enemies constantly off balance and unable to concentrate their superior numbers against me. I defeated the Piedmontese and the Austrians in a sequence of engagements that left military observers across Europe struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. Within a year, I had negotiated a peace with Austria that reshaped the map of northern Italy, and that I concluded largely on my own authority, acting as both general and diplomat in a way that was technically far beyond my mandate. and that the government in Paris could not entirely approve of, but could not repudiate, because the results were too spectacular. What would you have done with that kind of momentum? At 28 years old, the most celebrated general in France, with the love of the Paris crowds and the nervous admiration of the government that simultaneously needed you and feared what you might do next. Would you have been satisfied? Or would you have done what I did, which was to look east and see the one campaign that would add something no French general had attempted since the Crusades: Egypt and the ancient world? The Egyptian campaign of 1798 is remembered mostly as a military failure, and by the narrow measure of its strategic objectives it was. But what I took to Egypt and what I brought back from it transformed European understanding of the ancient world in ways whose consequences are still unfolding. I brought with me not just an army, but 151 scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, the Commission of Sciences and Arts, whose systematic study of Egypt produced the Description de l'Égypte, a 23-volume work that essentially founded the modern science of Egyptology. My soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone, the key that eventually unlocked the mystery of hieroglyphics and opened 3,000 years of Egyptian history to human understanding. A military campaign that ended in retreat produced one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the modern era. I have always thought that history does not give that enough credit. I returned to France in 1799 to find a government in crisis, a country exhausted by a decade of revolution and war, and a political vacuum that I stepped into with a speed and decisiveness that left everyone who might have opposed me no time to organize. The coup of the 18th of Brumaire made me first consul of France. Within 5 years, I was emperor. The transformation was so rapid and so complete that even I occasionally found it difficult to fully believe. The boy from Corsica, who had been mocked for his accent, sat on a throne in Notre Dame Cathedral, while the Pope of Rome stood beside him. I took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on my own head. It was a deliberate statement. No one had given me what I had. I had taken it myself. The decade of my empire from 1804 to 1814 was the period in which I reshaped Europe more fundamentally than any ruler since Charlemagne. On the battlefield, Austerlitz in 1805 was perhaps the most perfectly executed battle in the history of warfare. A tactical masterpiece in which I deliberately allowed the enemy to make the move I wanted them to make, and then destroyed them when they made it. Jena, Wagram, Friedland, a sequence of victories that left the crowned heads of Europe in a state of collective shock. But the campaigns were not the most enduring part of what I built. The Napoleonic Code, the legal framework I introduced in France and exported across the territories I controlled, established principles of equality before the law, protection of property rights, religious tolerance, and the abolition of feudal privilege that were genuinely revolutionary in the Europe of that time, and that still formed the foundation of the legal systems of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, Louisiana, and dozens of other jurisdictions around the world today. I am prouder of that code than of any battle I ever won. I divorced Josephine in 1809. It was the most painful decision of my reign and possibly of my life. She had never given me a child, and the empire I had built needed an heir. I knew she had been unfaithful in the early years of our marriage. I knew that the love I had felt for her was not equally returned in its intensity. I knew all of this, and still, the morning after I told her it was over, I was found by my servants sitting alone in the dark, unable to move, having apparently been there for hours. I married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise shortly after, and she gave me a son, Napoleon II, the King of Rome, a child I adored and who was taken from me by the collapse of my empire and died young in Vienna, kept from me by the very dynasty I had spent years fighting. That loss is the one that sits heaviest. I wonder what you are thinking now, at this point in my story, because I suspect you are waiting for Russia. Everyone waits for Russia. It is the moment that everyone who knows anything about me knows is coming. The way you know a storm is coming from the color of the sky an hour before it arrives. The campaign of 1812 against Tsar Alexander I was the beginning of the end, and I knew on some level before I crossed the Russian border that I was entering a different kind of war than any I had fought before. The Russians refused to fight me on my terms. They retreated. They burned their own cities and crops rather than let me feed my army from the land. I reached Moscow and found it empty and on fire, set alight by the Russians themselves. I sat in the Kremlin for 5 weeks waiting for the peace offer that never came. And then winter arrived. The retreat from Moscow is the darkest chapter I carry. The Grand Armée that had entered Russia with over 600,000 men came back across the frozen plains as a fraction of that number, destroyed not by Russian soldiers, but by cold, starvation and disease in conditions that no European army had ever encountered. Men froze to death standing up. Horses collapsed and were eaten within minutes. The road back to Poland was lined with the dead in numbers that I cannot think about without something closing in my chest that has no name I want to give it. I had led those men there. That is a weight that no victory, however brilliant, ever fully offsets. The coalition that formed against me after Russia included every major European power simultaneously, and it was more than even I could manage. I was defeated and abdicated in 1814, exiled to the island of Elba off the Italian coast, a small, comfortable exile that the powers of Europe intended as a permanent solution. They had misjudged me one final time. 10 months later, I walked off Elba with 1,000 men, landed in southern France, and marched to Paris. Every army sent to stop me joined me instead. I entered Paris without firing a shot. Louis XVIII fled. I was emperor again. The 100 days, history calls it, as if the brevity diminishes what it was. It was the most audacious thing I ever did, and I did it alone, with nothing but my name and the loyalty it still commanded. Waterloo ended it. The 18th of June 1815, a battle I came close to winning and that I have analyzed 10,000 times in the years since, looking for the decision that could have changed the outcome. There are several candidates. None of them are certain. What is certain is that Wellington held his ground long enough for the Prussians to arrive, and when they did, the campaign was over. I abdicated again. This time, there was no comfortable island near Italy. The British sent me to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, deliberately chosen as a place from which no escape was possible. I spent 6 years on St. Helena, under constant surveillance, in a damp house that destroyed my health, supervised by a British governor named Hudson Lowe, who treated his assignment as a personal mission to make my existence as uncomfortable as possible. I spent those years dictating my memoirs, constructing the version of my legacy that I wanted history to receive, and suffering from a stomach condition that grew progressively worse until it killed me on the 5th of May 1821. I was 51 years old. Modern analysis of samples of my hair has detected levels of arsenic significantly above normal, and the debate about whether I was deliberately poisoned by the British or by someone in my own household has never been fully resolved. I will leave that question where it has always been, unanswered, inconclusive, and deeply unsettling to the people who prefer clean endings. There is one lie about me that I want to address directly before I finish, because it has followed my name for 2 centuries, and it began as deliberate British propaganda during the wars, and somehow became accepted as fact. I was not unusually short. I was 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall in modern measurements, which was average or slightly above average for a French man of my time. The confusion arose from a difference between French and English measurement units, and from British caricaturists who drew me small to make me ridiculous. The Little Corporal was a nickname my own soldiers gave me affectionately, not a description of my height. That a lie so easily checked has persisted for 200 years. Tells you everything you need to know about how history gets written, and by whom. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican boy they laughed at who became Emperor of France and reshaped the legal foundations of the modern world. And although the empires that defeated me sent me to die on a rock in the middle of the ocean, here I remain. In the legal codes that protect the rights of ordinary people across dozens of countries every single day. In the military academies that still study my campaigns 2 centuries later. In every person who has ever been told that where they come from determines where they can go, and who refused to accept that verdict. The island could hold my body. It could not hold what I had already set in motion, and neither distance nor time has managed to finish that job since.